7:12 a.m. My phone buzzed with a message from Kevin. Plans have changed. You are not going on the cruise. My daughter wants her real dad. I looked up at the framed family portrait on the wall. He had planned this long ago, and he wasn't even hiding his contempt anymore. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just opened my laptop and started typing. Have you ever experienced the cold realization of being betrayed by the person you trusted most? Share your story in the comments below. I will listen to every single one. I stared at the message, letting the words settle into the ledger of my life. For 5 years, I had been the silent investor in Kevin's version of a family. I had provided the seed capital for his logistics company, draining my own savings to build his empire from the ground up. In return, the unspoken contract dictated that I play the dutiful, quiet wife, stepping back from my own career as a financial analyst so his fragile ego could take the spotlight. Love, I now realized, had been a premium subscription service, and I had been the only one footing the bill month after month. The anger wasn't loud. It didn't scream or throw plates against the wall. It was clinical, precise, and calculating. I looked back at the years of subtle manipulation, the compounding interest of his deceit. Every time I suggested returning to my firm, he would manufacture a domestic crisis. Every time I wanted to review the company ledgers, he would gaslight me into believing I was being an unsupportive partner. It is a strange psychological phenomenon, this invisible chain of the survivor. You endure a toxic environment for so long that your brain normalizes the dysfunction to survive. It is a state of learned helplessness, a psychological deficit. You convince yourself that the daily compromises are just long-term investments in a shared future, failing to realize that the other person is methodically liquidating your self-worth. You stop fighting, not because you are weak, but because the daily emotional attrition drains your capital until you forget you hold the controlling shares of your own life. But that text message broke the spell. The sudden, brazen cruelty of replacing me on a family vacation, of weaponizing his daughter against me, snapped the invisible chain. This was not an emotional breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and Kevin had just defaulted on his debt. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon regret, but there was only absolute clarity. I walked into his home office, the room paid for by my initial investments, and sat at his heavy oak desk. I bypassed his elementary passwords with the ease of a woman who had designed the original security architecture. He had been far too lazy to change the administrative credentials I originally set up, a fatal mistake for a man who thought he was a mastermind. My heart did not race. My hands did not tremble. They moved across the keyboard with the cold efficiency of an auditor conducting a hostile takeover. I had built the financial foundation he currently stood on, and now I was going to systematically dismantle it. He wanted to cut me out of the vacation. He wanted to cut me out of the family. He thought I would quietly pack my bags, shed a few tears, and accept the total devaluation of my life. He was fundamentally wrong. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. They weren't going to be shocked by the cruelty of what they had done. They were going to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. The spreadsheet of our marriage was officially closed. It was time for aggressive liquidation, and I was going to audit every single transaction. The glow of the monitor illuminated the dark office as I navigated through the labyrinth of Kevin's corporate accounts. I didn't need to guess where he hid his assets. I was a financial analyst. I knew how to follow the money. I initiated a deep scan of the offshore routing numbers and the subsidiary shell companies he thought were untraceable. Within 20 minutes, the clinical detachment I had summoned was put to the test. I uncovered a hidden directory containing digital copies of import and export contracts. I opened the first file, scanning the dense legal jargon until I reached the final page. My eyes locked onto the signature line. There, written in perfectly forged ink, was my name. I opened another file, then a third. Dozens of contracts, moving unregulated electronics and restricted materials across international borders, all authorized by my forged signature. Kevin wasn't just hiding assets. He was using me as his corporate shield, setting me up to take the fall for a massive illegal smuggling operation. The betrayal shifted from a personal grievance to a severe legal liability. The man I had shared a bed with had designated me as his primary scapegoat. Anger wasn't loud this time either. It was absolute zero. He had turned my identity into a fraudulent asset, gambling my freedom to protect his profit margins. I didn't panic. Panic is a useless emotion that only clouds judgment. Instead, I began to execute a massive counter-offensive. I pulled up the primary accounts, the ones he was systematically draining to secure his new life without me. He was moving funds in small, calculated increments to avoid triggering bank alerts. It was a sloppy, amateur strategy. I was a professional. By utilizing the administrative master keys and my own verified credentials, I effectively bypassed the routine anti-money laundering AML flags that would have tripped up a less privileged user. I opened a series of encrypted, untraceable accounts I had maintained since my days on Wall Street. Instead of clumsy withdrawals that would trigger bank alerts, I silently rerouted all pending high-value payments from his clients into a secure, escrow-controlled trust. I didn't steal the money. I simply intercepted the revenue stream at the source, starving his operating accounts of their lifeblood. $750,000 from the primary operating account. $1.2 million from the offshore holding firm. I redirected the assets into a secure trust that he could never access, legally binding the funds under my sole control. I was bleeding his empire dry, withdrawing my initial investment with 5 years of exorbitant interest. Every click of the mouse was a deliberate reclamation of my power. He thought he was outsmarting a naive housewife, completely forgetting that he had married a financial predator. I watched the progress bars fill, tracking the millions of dollars draining from his grasp and returning to mine. I was leaving him with just enough operational capital to maintain the illusion of solvency until his upcoming corporate gala, let him stand on stage and boast about his success while standing on a financial sinkhole. By the time the clock struck 4 a.m, the reverse heist was complete. The accounts were secured. The evidence of his forgery was downloaded onto an encrypted drive. I closed the laptop, leaving the desk exactly as I had found it. I had neutralized his financial strategy before he even realized the war had begun. The financial extraction was only the first phase of the audit. I needed to understand the full scope of Kevin's liability. I dug deeper into the server, bypassing a poorly configured firewall, protecting his private communications with his business partner, Brian. Brian was a 45-year-old opportunist who had always treated me with thinly veiled condescension. I accessed their shared email server and began filtering for my name and the word liability. What I found was a string of correspondence that completely eradicated any lingering shred of humanity I felt toward my husband. It wasn't just a casual forgery. It was a premeditated, highly orchestrated conspiracy. I read an email dated 3 months prior, written by Brian. The auditors are getting closer to the customs discrepancy. We need a firewall. Kevin's response was sent 2 hours later. The offshore contracts are all under Sarah's name. I have the forged authorizations documented. If the feds raid the office, all the illegal routing points directly to her. We feign ignorance, file for divorce, and let her take the minimum 10-year sentence. She is completely clueless. 10 years. They had calculated my freedom as the acceptable cost of doing business. This was the lethal discovery, the ultimate criminal twist. This was no longer a standard divorce proceeding over infidelity or irreconcilable differences. This was a battle for my basic survival. They had structured a narrative where I would be handcuffed and thrown into a federal prison while Kevin enjoyed his cruise and his stolen wealth. I felt a cold, metallic, calm wash over me. They wanted to play a high-stakes legal game, but they had drastically underestimated their opponent. I methodically downloaded the entire email chain, exporting the server logs to prove the messages originated from Kevin's IP address. I cross-referenced the emails with the forged contracts and the offshore routing numbers, compiling an airtight, incontrovertible dossier of corporate fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. I didn't hesitate. At 5:30 in the morning, I opened a secure messaging application and contacted Walter, a ruthless corporate litigator I'd worked with during my time in the financial sector. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who lived to dismantle fraudulent empires. I attached the encrypted dossier. Walter, I typed, I have absolute proof of international customs fraud, massive embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit identity theft orchestrated by Kevin and Brian. I need immediate federal intervention. Review the files. We strike on Friday night during their project launch gala. The confirmation icon blinked almost instantly. Walter was awake. 10 minutes later, his reply came through. Files received. This is a federal prosecutor's dream, Sarah. The warrants will be ready by Friday. I am contacting my liaisons at the Bureau immediately. I closed the application and took a slow, measured breath. The trap was set. The legal machinery was already in motion, grinding its gears to crush Kevin and Brian. They had spent months building a prison for me, brick by forged brick. I was simply going to lock them inside it and throw away the key. Friday evening arrived with the suffocating elegance of a high society masquerade. Kevin's company was hosting a massive gala at a downtown hotel to celebrate the launch of their new international logistics project, the very project funded by my stolen money and built on my forged signature. I arrived wearing a flawless black evening gown, playing the role of the supportive wife one final time. Kevin looked incredibly smug in his tailored tuxedo. He barely acknowledged me, too busy schmoozing with local politicians and wealthy investors. Brian stood by his side, laughing loudly and clinking champagne glasses. They were completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance, totally unaware that the ground beneath them had already collapsed. At 8 o'clock, the lights dimmed and Kevin stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. I stood at the back of the ballroom, sipping sparkling water, watching the timeline of my retaliation count down to 0. "Thank you all for being here," Kevin began, his voice dripping with manufactured humility. "Building this company has been the challenge of a lifetime. It requires vision, ruthless dedication, and the willingness to leave behind anything or anyone that holds you back." He looked directly at me, a cruel, mocking smile playing on his lips. "Some people are meant to lead, and others are just meant to quietly support from the shadows. Tonight we celebrate the leaders." He was publicly humiliating me, essentially announcing my impending dismissal to a room full of our peers. I didn't flinch. I just checked my watch. 8:03 p.m, right on schedule. Walter had informed the feds that Kevin was planning to move the final batch of illicit offshore assets tonight, providing them with the necessary exigent circumstances to justify an immediate on-site intervention. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a violent crash. The ambient music abruptly cut off. A dozen federal agents in sharp, tailored suits, badges displayed, moved through the room with quiet, lethal efficiency. The crowd gasped, parting like the Red Sea as the lead agent walked directly toward the stage. Kevin's arrogant smile vanished, replaced by a mask of absolute panic. "Kevin Miller and Brian Hayes," the lead agent announced, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "You are under arrest for international customs, fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit identity theft." Kevin gripped the podium, his face turning an ashen grey. "There is a mistake," he stammered, looking frantically at the investors who were now backing away from him in horror. "Get my general counsel on the phone immediately. This is a witch hunt." "This is a misunderstanding." "Talk to my wife. She handles the offshore accounts." I stepped forward, stepping out of the shadows and into the light. I met his desperate, terrified gaze with eyes like crushed ice. "Actually, Kevin," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "I handle the audits, and your ledger is completely bankrupt." Brian tried to slip out a side door, but was immediately tackled and handcuffed by 2 agents. The federal officers marched onto the stage, pulling Kevin's hands behind his back and securing the steel cuffs. The clink of the metal was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. He looked at me as they dragged him off the stage, his eyes wide, with the sudden, crushing realization that I had orchestrated his total destruction. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were finally shocked that I had stopped playing along. The fallout was swift and absolute. Unable to access the offshore funds I had systematically drained, Kevin and Brian couldn't even afford to hire high-tier defense attorneys. The federal prosecutors used the encrypted dossier I provided to bury them under a mountain of irrefutable evidence. Kevin received a sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Brian received 12. With Kevin and Brian facing federal prison time, the board was left in chaos. I stepped in not as a spouse, but as the primary creditor of the company. I successfully petitioned the court to appoint me as the sole receiver to protect the company's assets from further criminal liability, effectively granting me total control during the restructuring process. It was, after all, built entirely on my initial capital and my strategic acumen. Within the year, after navigating the complex legal maze of receivership and board restructuring, I was sitting in the CEO's chair, the sole owner of a multi-million-dollar corporation. I purged the executive board, fired anyone loyal to Kevin, and aggressively rebranded the company under my own name. But simply destroying my enemies wasn't enough. Annihilation is a shallow victory if it doesn't yield new growth. I took a significant portion of the recovered assets and established a venture capital foundation specifically designed to fund female entrepreneurs. I wanted to help women who were trapped in the shadows of their partners' egos, women who had the brilliance and the drive but lacked the capital and the independence to break free. There is a distinct difference between the justice of the executioner and the justice of the planter. The executioner is satisfied with burning the toxic field to the ground, content to simply watch the ashes blow away in the bitter wind. But the planter knows that the most profound justice comes from taking that scorched earth, tilling it, and turning it into exceptionally fertile soil. The ultimate retaliation isn't just about ensuring the people who betrayed you suffer the full crushing consequences of their actions. It is about using the rubble of their destroyed empire to build a lasting sanctuary for others. By funding these ambitious women, I wasn't just erasing Kevin's fraudulent legacy, I was entirely replacing it with a monument to financial independence and resilience. I transformed a story of intense financial abuse into an engine for widespread economic empowerment. As I sit in my office today, looking out over the expansive city skyline, I no longer feel the heavy weight of that invisible chain. I've come to realize that surviving a profound betrayal isn't just about fighting back with cold logic. It is about fundamentally redefining your own value. I didn't do this for closure or peace. I did it because I had a business to run. Moving forward, unburdened by the past, was simply the most efficient way to build something beautiful from the wreckage. My name is Sarah, and I am no longer a silent investor in someone else's life. I am the absolute sole proprietor of my own destiny. Don't ever let anyone redefine your worth or convince you to step into the shadows. If Sarah's story inspired you, don't forget to press like and share to give strength to other women out there.